welcome to Positive Read-Ins. Today I'm going to look at Imre Kertész's first novel, Fateless, which was published in 1975. Kertész is a Hungarian, or was a Hungarian writer, a Jewish writer, and his first novel is essentially his story, his childhood story of being arrested and brought to Auschwitz and later Buchenwald and then Zeitz, which is a work camp. And so this is very much can go in with the kind of the pantheon of Holocaust novels. There are many of them, and I find this one to be highly interesting, and it gives a slightly different, I think, a more realistic view of the human experience in a camp, in a difficult situation, in the horrors that I cannot even imagine. But we get this young boy reflecting on these experiences, and at the same time just reporting what's going on. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in this novel. Partly we get a reportage style, though I would say stylistically there are some challenges. The paragraphs are very long in this piece. We also get a little bit of a coming-of-age story. It's a 14-year-old boy. There's a little bit of kind of a slightly of a sexual awakening, partly at the beginning. And then also, I think most interestingly, we get this kind of anger, this feeling of not being able to express what has been experienced afterwards when Guri gets out of the camp and returns home. At that point, his mother has remarried, his father has been murdered, and he has a few relatives maybe around still, and he can't really communicate this experience to them. So Kertész is definitely a controversial writer. For several different reasons, but I think one, and the relevant and interesting reason, is some of the things he had to say about not the Holocaust necessarily, but how the Holocaust is remembered today. So I think that's an interesting place to begin, his perspective on this, and then we can go look at this novel. He has an interesting essay here called Who Owns Auschwitz? This was published in the Yale Journal of Criticism. And he begins by making a very insightful point. So he says, for the Holocaust to become, with time, a real part of European, or at least Western European, public consciousness, the price inevitably extracted in exchange for public notoriety had to be paid. Thus, we immediately got a stylization of the Holocaust, a stylization which has by now grown to nearly unbearable dimensions. The word Holocaust is already a stylization, an affected abstraction from more brutal sounding terms like extermination camp or final solution. So part of the argument he's presenting here, and I think this also comes through in his novel, is that in order for this event, the Holocaust, to become part of the public consciousness, for everyone to think about this and talk about this, it has to be stylized. There has to be a kind of an institutionalized way of thinking and talking about this, and anyone who is outside of that, obviously, will be either kind of reprimanded or maybe just forgotten simply. And I think Kertész, to some degree, fits that bill. And so he's calling this a stylization, right? Later, he refers to this as moral political rituals. He talks about Holocaust Puritans, Holocaust dogmatists, Holocaust usurpers. So he definitely has this view of a number of people coming out and trying to use the Holocaust as a way to maybe shape their own experience, shape their own, or maybe to thrust their memory onto that, and make that become kind of the canonical way of remembering the Holocaust. This comes out particularly in this essay, and this is one of the controversial things about Kertesz, is he criticized Steven Spielberg, which we'll get to in a minute. Actually, we'll get to it now. So he referred to Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List as kitsch, and what he meant by that, I think, it's worth reading. So I'm going to read this section here. He says, "I regard as kitsch any representation of the Holocaust that is incapable of understanding or unwilling to understand the organic connection between our own deformed mode of life, whether in the private sphere or on the level of civilization as such, and the very possibility of the Holocaust. Here, I have in mind those representations that seek to establish the Holocaust once and for all as something foreign to human nature, that seek to drive the Holocaust out of the realm of human experience." So, in part, he's trying to push up against this idea that the Holocaust was not that it's that it, of course I think he believes that it was a grave evil, but nothing out of the ordinary for what humans can do. I think that's the point he's trying to make. That it's not, he's trying to say that these movies and these books are trying to push it out of the realm of human experience, and he's saying no, it's right in human experience and it's part of our nature. I think that's what he's trying to get at, which I think is an ugly truth. I would also use the term kitsch to describe those works where Auschwitz is regarded as simply a matter concerning Germans and Jews, and thereby reduced to something like the fatal incompatibility of two groups, when the political and psychological anatomy of modern totalitarianism more generally is disregarded, when Auschwitz is not seen as a universal experience, but reduced to whatever immediately hits the eye. Apart from this, of course, I regard anything that is kitsch as kitsch. So I think that's another important point, this idea that he looks at Auschwitz as something that is part of a universal experience. Of course, it's a particular example, but he's relating this to a universal experience. And then he later goes on in this essay to hold up Roberto Bernini's Life is Beautiful as a better example of a story that kind of captures the reality of the Holocaust. And that brings us to his novel, because I think Kertész's novel is another great example of a story that captures the reality of the Holocaust in in some ways it feels like like I said, like reportage or even a science text. Then others, it definitely has the emotions that spring from reading works of literature. So there's a few things I want to look at here, and I'm going to just move in chronological order in the book. So the very beginning, we have Gyuri's father gets sent off to the camp, and they kind of have a little farewell for him, and then he just goes. Shortly after that, Gyuri himself is going to get picked up with a group of friends. It doesn't really seem like shocking. It is, I guess it's a bit shocking for them, but it doesn't seem like anything traumatic. They're just heading off somewhere, right? That's how it's depicted. But before that, I thought we have some interesting just developments of his character, and I wanted to read one of these here. So with the neighbor, Anna Marie, he's with her, he's spending time with her. So and it says, "As to her, by the way, I am now in a somewhat peculiar situation. The incident occurred the day before yesterday, during the alert on Friday night, down in the air raid shelter, or to be more precise, in one of the deserted, dimly lit cellar passages into which it opens. Originally, I only wanted to show her that it was more interesting to follow what is happening on the outside from there. But then, about a minute later, we heard a bomb actually go off nearby. She started trembling all over. It was really good because in her tremor, she clung to me, her arms around my neck, her face buried in my shoulder. All I remember after that was searching for her lips. I was left with the vague experience of a warm, moist, slightly sticky contact. Well, and also a kind of happy astonishment, for it was my first kiss, with a girl, after all, besides which I had not been reckoning on it right then. Yesterday on the stairwell it emerged that she, too, had been very surprised. It was all because of the bomb, she considered. Basically, she was right. Later on, we kissed again, and that was when she taught me how to make the experience more memorable by also doing certain things with our tongues. So this is an innocent first kiss experience, kind of naive of the boy, even though he's reflected on this some time after. But I thought this was important because it, even though this element obviously leaves the story as we get into the Holocaust, it shows kind of the real reality that gets kind of taken away from the Holocaust, from this kind of this machine of processing people and exterminating them. These real moments of a young boy, 14, and a young girl discovering their kind of sexual identity. There is a little bit more of that comes in later, but again, that's really the only kind of moment of love we get in this novel. It's a fairly bleak novel, of course. The next part I want to look at is the arrival to Auschwitz, and I think I found this very powerful. Just the description, and again, it's matter of fact. It's not no fancy writing. This writer is, I think, a fan of the long sentence, but beyond that, it's not highly stylized. We're just getting the details of what's going on here. So I'm going to read this. The first thing I noticed was a vast expanse. So this is right when he gets off the train. A vast expanse of what looked like flat terrain. I was immediately a little blinded by the sudden spaciousness, the uniformly white, eye-stabbing brilliance of the sky and the plain. I did not have much time to look around, though. What with the bustling and teeming, the cries, tiny incidents, and sorting out going on all around me. We would now, I heard, have to separate from the women for a short while, for after all, we could not bathe together with them under the same roof. However, there were motor vehicles waiting a bit further away for the elderly, the weak mothers with infants, and those who had been exhausted by the journey. We were given to understand all this by a new set of prisoners, though I noticed that out here they were now German soldiers in green forage caps and with green collars on their tunics, who were keeping an eye on everything and making eloquent hand gestures to indicate directions. And, this first, as someone who grew up obviously knowing about the Holocaust, like all of us today, we know that this separation is happening because the weak and the children, the too young, the ones who can't work are essentially going to be exterminated. But even still, I think as you read this, you're discovering this with Curie. He sees this and he doesn't really know what happens. He discovers that as we go. And then seeing them part, just to skip ahead a little bit, again, I thought this was very affecting. He writes here, then a tall, sharp-featured man and a woman with long, black hair clung to one another, faces, lips, their entire bodies locked together, causing everyone a flash of irritation, until the ceaseless buffeting of the human tide finally detached the woman, or rather girl, carrying her away and swallowing her up, though even as she receded I saw her a few times more struggling to remain in view and waving a sweeping farewell from where she was. And that irritation they're talking about experiencing is because they're clinging to each other. They're trying to delay this separation because, again, everyone believes that they're going to get back together, or maybe the part of them, partly they know that's not going to be the case. And of course, as a reader, we know what's happening here. So again, I thought this was very sad, this part here. Connecting to what Kertesz said in Who Owns Auschwitz, this idea of kind of the ways that we remember the Holocaust, and the fact that Kertesz, I think ultimately his thesis is that the Holocaust was a product of an institutional product of a deformed way of life, and it's not, some random great evil, but it's a great evil that is commonplace in us. And this is brought up, I think, definitely implied here in this passage I want to look at. So this is when, after he gets to Auschwitz, he's, bathes, has his hair cut, and he's just waiting basically to move off to another camp. And throughout the book, we're constantly getting Geary's kind of realizations, and this is a realization that he has here. Another thing that somewhat set me thinking that day was the fact that, as I was informed, this place, this institution, had already been in existence for years, standing here and operating exactly the same way, day after day. But nevertheless, as it were, and I admit this notion may, perhaps, contain a certain element of exaggeration, ready and waiting for me. In any event, our own block chief, more than a few people referred to this with distinct, one could say, awestruck admiration, had already been living here for 4 years. It occurred to me that that had been a year of particular significance for me, being when I enrolled at the grammar school. The occasion of the opening ceremony for the school year was still lodged firmly in my memory. I, too, was there in a dark blue, braided Hungarian-style uniform, a so-called boszkai suit. Even the headmaster's words had registered, he himself being a man of distinguished, and now I think back on it, somewhat commanding presence, with severe eyeglasses and a majestic white handlebar mustache. In winding up, he had made reference, I recollected, to an ancient Roman philosopher quoting the tag, non scholae sed vitae discimus. Sorry for my Latin. We learn for life, not school. But then, in light of that, really, I ought to have been learning all along exclusively about Auschwitz. Everything would have been explained openly, honestly, reasonably. The thing was, though, that over the 4 years at school, I had heard not a single word about it. Of course, that would have been embarrassing, I conceded, nor indeed did it belong to education, I realize. The drawback, however, was that now I would have to be edified here. To learn, for example, that we are in a Konzentrationslager, a concentration camp. Not that these were all the same, it was explained. This one, for example, is a Vernichtungslager, that is to say, an extermination camp, I was informed. In Arbeitslager, or work camp, on the other hand, it was immediately added, was something quite different. Life there was easy. The conditions and food, the rumors went, bore no comparison, which is natural enough, as the aim, after all, is also different. So I found this passage very, very thought-provoking because, on the one hand, Geary is showing us that he was coming to the realization that this camp has been here for years, and he was basically just living his life up to arriving there, right? As he said, it was ready and waiting for me. The chief there had already been there for 4 years, and he's comparing that to what he's doing in school, right? We learn for life, not school. Well, he wasn't being prepared for this machinery that he was entering, these work camps, these extermination camps. He wasn't being educated about that. Now, of course, as he mentions, that's not part of school life, but one of the points he brings up near the end is, himself included, were moving towards this place. They knew about it. It was there, right? Why wasn't he talking about it? Why wasn't he learning more about this? As this possibly being his fate, which obviously ties into the title here. So definitely you can see this is one of the perspectives that I think is more controversial and not your typical perspective that you get in a Holocaust novel. After this scene, Guri is eventually brought to Buchenwald and then to Zeitz, where it's a work camp, and through several, well, at least 100 pages, we see his health deteriorate. There's a number of kind of minor characters that he interacts with. One he even becomes fairly close with, who he tries to see afterwards when he gets out, who is not there, so it's implied that maybe he didn't survive. And there's one point where it even seems like Guri is going to die, right? He gets very bad health. I think he might even have to have some kind of surgery. But and I'm going to skip over all. I mean, all of that I think is very, very much powerful reading. But I want to get to the part near the end where he gets out, he goes back home, and he obviously, like I said, his father has been killed, his mother has remarried, but he goes and visits his old neighborhood, his old flat, and he sees these two uncles, and they tell him, and I'll just read here, that before all else, he declared, so this is one of the uncles, "You must put the horrors behind you." Increasingly amazed, I asked, "Why should I?" "In order," he replied, "to be able to live," at which Uncle Fleischmann nodded and added, "Live freely," at which the other old boy nodded and added, "One cannot start a new life under such a burden." And I had to admit, he did have a point, except I didn't quite understand how they could wish for something that was impossible. And indeed, I made the comment that what had happened, and anyway, when it came down to it, I could not give orders to my memory. Again, one of the big focuses of this novel is just the nature of memory, which I think also comes up in this essay, Who Owns Auschwitz? I would only be able to start a new life, I ventured, if I were to be reborn, or if some affliction, disease, or something of the sort were to affect my mind, which they surely didn't wish on me, I hoped. In any case, I added, I didn't notice any atrocities, at which I could see. They were greatly astounded. What were they supposed to understand by that? They wished to know by I didn't notice. To what, however, I asked them in turn, what they had done during those hard times. We lived, one of them deliberated. We tried to survive, the other added. Precisely. They, too, had taken one step at a time, I noted. What did I mean by taking a step, they floundered, so I related to them how it had gone in Auschwitz. By way of example, for each train, and I am not saying it was always necessarily this number, since I have no way of knowing. But at any rate, in our case, we have to reckon on around 3,000 people. Take the men among them, 1,000, let's say, for the sake of example. You can reckon on 1 or 2 seconds per case, more often 1 than 2. Ignore the very first and very last, because they don't count. But in the middle, where I too was standing, you could therefore have to allow 10 or 20 minutes before you reach the point where it is decided whether it will be gas immediately or a reprieve for the time being. Now, all this time, the queue is constantly moving, progressing, and everyone is taking steps, bigger or smaller ones, depending on what the speed of the operation demands. So at this point, he starts developing this concept or this idea of like taking steps, one step at a time towards your fate. And he refers back to this moment which is narrated earlier in the novel, where you get to that point and it's decided whether you're too young or weak and you go to the gas, or you keep going and eventually you go to a work camp. A brief hush ensued, broken only by a single sound. Aunt Fleischmann took the empty dish from in front of me and carried it away, nor did I see her return subsequently. The two old boys asked, "What has that got to do with it? And what do you mean by it?" "Nothing in particular," I replied, "but it was not quite true that the thing came about. We had gone along with it too. Only now, and thus after the event, looking back in hindsight, does the way it all came about seem over, finished, unalterable, finite, so tremendously fast, and so terribly opaque. And if, in addition, one knows one's fate in advance, of course, then indeed one can only register the passing of time. So, again, the point he's making here, which you can see it's a difficult one, but he's trying to show that these uncles that we saw this coming and we went with it. We didn't put up this, as part of our fate. It was just something we were born into. This eventually obviously upsets them, partly because he brings up the fact that, similarly, I think he says the line here, when it comes down to it, each and every minute, something else might have happened other than what actually did happen at Auschwitz, just as much as, let's suppose, here at home when we took leave of my father. So this idea that they just kind of said goodbye to the father, had a little going away party for him, and he left. And then, again, they're getting upset about this, but he brings up this point to clarify more. He says, it's about the steps. Everyone took steps as long as he was able to take a step. I, too, took my own steps, and not just in the queue at Birkenau, but even before that, here at home. I took steps with my father, and I took steps with my mother. I took steps with Anna Marie, and I took steps, perhaps, the most difficult ones of all, with the older sister. I would now be able to tell her what it means to be Jewish, because there was a part where she was asking about, well, what does it mean to even be Jewish? And he didn't really know. And now he's saying he does from this experience. But his answer here, nothing. Nothing to me, at least, at the beginning until those steps start to be taken. None of it is true. There is no different blood, nothing else, only, and I faltered, and suddenly something the journalist had said came into my mind. And that journalist is someone he met with and who wanted to basically take his story, write about his story. There are only given situations and the new givens inherent in them. I too had lived through a given fate. It had not been my own fate, but I had lived through it, and I simply couldn't understand why they couldn't get it into their heads that I now needed to start doing something with my fate, needed to connect it with somewhere or something. After all, I could no longer be satisfied with the notion that it had all been a mistake, blind fortune, some kind of blunder, let alone that it had not even happened. And when he refers to it had not been my fate, I think he's saying the fact that, just by being Jewish, something he didn't really even understand, and even within the concentration camp, the fact that he didn't speak Yiddish, he was kind of isolated and almost looked at as not being Jewish, and I think that's what he's referring to here as not my fate. So as I said, this eventually leads to the uncles being upset, and he goes out, and I just want to end with this last scene, because I think this is also another very powerful and even beautiful kind of description he gives us here. And at the time I was reading this, I found it just very surprising, actually. Let me just read this here. Down below, I was greeted by the street. I need to take a streetcar to my mother's place, but now it dawned on me that I had no money, of course, so I decided to walk. In order to gather my strength, I paused for a minute at the square, by the aforementioned bench. Over ahead, in the direction that I would need to take, where the street appeared to lengthen, expand, and fade away into infinity. The fleecy clouds over the indigo hills were already turning purple, and the sky a shade of claret. Around me, it was as if something had changed. The traffic had dwindled, people's steps had slowed, their voices became quieter. Their features grown softer, and it was as if their faces were turning toward one another. It was that peculiar hour I recognized, even now, even here, my favorite hour in the camp, and I was seized by a sharp, painful, futile longing for it, nostalgia, homesickness. And I think he's referring to nostalgia for the camp, which again, as you can imagine, would be surprising. Suddenly it sprang to life. It was all here and bubbling inside me. All its strange moods surprised me. Its fragmentary memories set me trembling. Yes, in a certain sense, life there had been clearer and simpler. Everything came back to mind, and I considered everyone in turn, both those who were of no interest and those whose only recognition would come in this reckoning. And he named some of the people there that he remembered. But one shouldn't exaggerate. As this is precisely the crux of it. I am here, and I am well aware that I shall accept my rationale as the price for being able to live. Yes, as I looked around this placid, twilit square, this street, weather-beaten yet full of 1,000 promises, I was already feeling a growing and accumulating readiness to continue my continuable life. My mother was waiting and would no doubt greatly rejoice over me. I recollect that she had once conceived a plan that I should be an engineer, a doctor, or something like that. No doubt that is how it will be, just as she wished. There is nothing impossible that we do not live through naturally, and keeping a watch on me on my journey, like some inescapable trap, I already know there will be happiness. For even there, next to the chimneys, in the intervals between the torments, there was something that resembled happiness. Everyone asks only about the hardships and the atrocities, whereas for me, perhaps, it is that experience which will remain the most memorable. Yes, the next time I am asked, I ought to speak about that, the happiness of the concentration camps, if indeed I am asked, and provided I myself don't forget. So again, I found this very, shocking at first when I read this, or surprising that he's focusing on these little moments of happiness that he had in this horrible, as he said, torments, between the torments. But he's also talking about the fact that he might even forget these. And I think, again, that's referring to if his memory is taken over by kind of the stylization of the Holocaust. So it's a very complex view of the Holocaust, of an atrocity, but a very human view, I think, showing that even in these horrible situations, we're living, we're human, and we have a range of emotions there. So a complex book, definitely worth reading. Thank you for watching Positive Readings. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe. Reading and writing are choices. Let's make them.